بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستجيره ونستنصره فإنه حق من هدى الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له وندعو ونقول اللهم يا رب العالمين إنا نتوكل عليك ونعوذ بك أن نضل أو نضل أو نزل أو نزل أو أن نظلم أو نظلم أو أن نجهل أو نستجهل. اللهم يا نور السماوات والأرض اجعل في قلوبنا نورا واجعل في ألسننا نورا واجعل في عقولنا نورا واجعل في أرواحنا نورا واجعل في بيوتنا نورا. اللهم أعظم لنا نورا. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وعلى أصحابه وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. We live in a small universe. In this small universe, those who possess power have the ability to make that power resonate to every corner of the globe and to yield and leverage that power to levels that are truly unprecedented in human history. The irony is that as human beings, advanced technologically, so many of these technological inventions were designed to enable the individual, to allow the individual to do things that individuals could not do a short period ago. But the irony is that these very same inventions that empower the individual in a very localized sense are also inventions that allow power to be yielded by an elite to levels and degrees unknown in human history. The khutbah today is a little bit unusual in that I will talk about something that affects us all as American Muslims, but that we hardly pay attention to. And that is the way that our government uses taxpayers' money to help engineer and craft the faith of Islam around the world. The irony is that although our Constitution demands separation of church and state, and although within the national borders of the United States, the federal government would be severely constrained in its ability to establish a religion of sorts. Establish a religion means to craft and direct and interpret and pursue its interpretation of a religious faith. The secularism of the American government is supposed to be a secularism within and without. It's supposed to be a secularism in terms of an objective distance towards all religious faith. The government is not supposed to choose among religions and is not supposed to advance one religion while not advancing others. But this is not the way things in fact work once we deal with the impact of the federal government outside the borders of the United States. And obviously I'm talking here specifically about Islam. There are many examples that I can address, but I'm going to focus on one example because of recent events that I will share with you and what these events tell us about the world we live in and the types of imperatives and obligations that fall upon us as American Muslims. After the United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, the Bush administration was concerned to a large degree because of the Jazeera channel, but not exclusively so, but to a larger degree because of the Jazeera channel, that the United States was getting bad press in the Middle East in particular, and in the Arabic-speaking world. And so, using taxpayers' money, the United States created a television channel called Alhurra, which translates to the free, or the Freedom Channel, or the Liberty Channel. The Hurra channel was initially designed to represent the American point of view of things, the American point of view on critical issues such as the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Afghanistan, and defending whatever US policies exist in, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, but more broadly in the Middle East. Over 20 years later now, or about 20 years later, Al-Hurra channel has a thoroughly redefined mission, not formal mission, but an actual mission that we see in practice. Alhurra channel does not spend a lot of time talking about US foreign policy in the Middle East, does not spend a lot of time talking about American forces in Iraq or American forces in Afghanistan. But Alhurra channel has become a platform for a very specific type of perspective on the Islamic religion. Not on Christianity, not on Judaism, but specifically and particularly on Islam. Alhurra channel has become a regular podium for figures like Ibrahim Isa and Islam al-Bahiri and others that are spearheading what is self-described as al-Haraka al-Tanwiriyya, or the Enlightenment movement in the Arabic world or in the Arabic-speaking world. The name is deceiving because what this Enlightenment movement consists of, it doesn't talk about democracy, it doesn't talk about human rights abuses as committed by the Egyptian government or the Saudi government or the Emirati government, or the human rights abuses committed by Haftar's forces in Libya, or Emirati forces or Saudi forces in Yemen. In fact, it hardly talks about human rights at all, except certain specific type of rights for a very particular type of people. But the so-called Al-Haraka al-Tanwiriyya is very much the type of thing that Hershey Ali here in the United States declared and announced and spearheaded some 15 or 20 years ago, when it said that the problem with Islam is the immorality of its very sources. That the Prophet of Islam was an immoral man, and that the Quran itself is an immoral book, and that there is no way for Muslims to reform unless Muslims recognize the immorality of their holy book and the immorality of their prophet. Remarkably, the likes of Ibrahim Isa and Islam al-Bahiri do nothing but day after day criticize everything Islamic in the most Islamophobic way. They criticize Islamic history, they criticize the Islamic holy book, they criticize the Sunnah of the Prophet, they criticize the companions of the Prophet, they criticize Ahlul Bayt, they criticize everything. From their perspective, you can hardly find a saving grace in Islam at all. Because if you listen to Islam al-Bahiri and Ibrahim Isa and Khalid Muntasir and Fatma Na'out and the like, you truly wonder what can possibly be a saving grace of this religious tradition. The Quran is flawed, and immoral. The Sunnah is replete with immorality. Islam itself generated nothing but immorality. That's not my issue, and that's not the problem. The problem is that Alhurra channel is a channel paid for by US tax dollars. The Hurra channel is not a platform for diverse perspectives on the Islamic religion. It is not a platform for diverse perspective on Christianity or Judaism, or a free and open debate about the rights of Palestinians as well as the rights of others. It is not a platform for free and open debate on the merits and demerits of various Islamic thinkers through history. It is slowly a podium for Hershey Ali-like critique of Islam broadcasted, and no other perspective appears on Al-Hurra channel. Khalid Abul Fadl will never appear on Al-Hurra channel. The late Muhammad Imara would never appear on Al-Hurra channel. Not because they don't want to, but because Al-Hurra will never allow them to. To me, this is no minor matter. No minor matter. The very history of secularism in the West has always suffered from this hypocritical paradox. On the one hand, while secularism was declared as a principle of the state within the internal dynamics of the state, but colonial powers throughout history, whether the British, the French, the Dutch, the Americans, have acted like missionary zealots when it came to their foreign policy. And they have been able to do so without any scrutiny from law, because of the doctrines of jurisdiction within the legal system. Courts will often not recognize anyone as having legal standing to bring the lawsuit against the US for the way it is spending tax dollars to promote a particular religious view, and in this case, a deeply skeptical religious view of the Islamic faith. Courts will often not recognize that they have jurisdiction to force the government not to take sides on religious affairs when it comes to foreign policy. So the solution is awareness, and the solution is political pressure. What the federal government does with something like Al-Hurra channel reinforces the image of the United States around the Muslim world as a hypocritical political force. On the one hand, the US says it defends democracy and human rights and it is not for or against any religious faith. But on the other hand, day in and day out, all you have to do is tune into Alhurra channel to see that the United States government in fact does embrace a stand on what type of Islam they deem acceptable in the world we live in today. And this is long before the supposed age of colonialism has supposedly ended. Long after colonialism has supposedly ended. And to our very day. But I raise this issue for an even deeper point. Recently, there is an Egyptian public figure, his name is Nawal al Saadawi, passed away. Nawal al Saadawi views on the Islamic religion are infamous. She's written 47 books to set out these views. According to Nawal al Saadawi, Islam, like all other religions, is a racist religion, is a classist religion, and it's a sexist religion. According to Nawal al Saadawi, there is no hell and no heaven and no accountability. It's all a mythology. According to the same, Hajj is a form of idol worshipping, and there should be no Hajj. In other words, she was opposed to the whole institution of Hajj. But Nawal al Saadawi was also opposed to any form of ibadah. You don't need to do salah, you don't need to do sawm, you don't need to do Hajj. Nawal al Saadawi believed that it was wrong of God to regulate sexuality and to say that zina is haram and adultery is haram because according to her, this is your personal choice and personal freedom. And any religion that tries to regulate these issues is sexist and other things. Moreover, she wrote a rather well-known book where she describes God and argues that if God exists, then that is an unjust God who doesn't deserve to be worshipped. Moreover, she advocated a legal and official ban on the hijab throughout the Muslim world. In her view, people should be free to walk nude in the streets if they wish to do so, because it's a matter of personal choice. Nawal al Saadawi was a medical doctor, not a deep thinker, but someone who shoots from the hip. Whatever made sense to her, she spewed out. By training, she's a medical doctor. By writing, a moderately talented novelist and an abysmal philosopher. But for one thing, because of the highly critical pronouncements someone like Nawal al Saadawi made against Islam, she has won a dozen prestigious awards from various European and American institutions. Although she doesn't have a PhD and she has no academic qualifications, she was invited to teach at Duke for 10 years. She was even nominated to the Nobel Peace Prize at one point. But even more, and this is the most critical issue, Nawal al Saadawi regularly, until the very last days of her life, would regularly appear on Alhurra channel as an honored, elevated guest, and would regularly appear all over Egyptian TV and Emirati TV and related channels as a great and deep thinker. That would all be fine if those who engaged Nawal al Saadawi critically and analytically, like the late Muhammad Imara, were also allowed to appear on the same news venues. But Muhammad Imara was never allowed to appear on Al-Hurra channel. And Muhammad Imara eventually was banned by the Egyptian government from appearing on TV at all. And Muhammad Imara was banned from writing, even publishing articles in newspapers. So the picture, contrary to what the typical Orientalist jargon goes, it is not the case that in the Muslim world today, that if you are an atheist, or that if you espouse highly critical views of Islam, it is not the case that you are censored and only the religious are given a platform. In fact, things have flipped into exactly the opposite. Azhar is not allowed to respond to what Islam al-Bahiri says on Al-Hurra. And this is the rector of Azhar himself who announced this, who admitted this openly. Said the Egyptian government does not allow me to as much as respond to what Ibrahim Isa says, or Islam Bahiri says, or Nawal Saadawi says on channels like Al-Hurra. While people like Ahmad Sabih and Salman Auda are rotting in prison. And people like Muhammad Imara were banned until the day they died. To put it simply and bluntly, there is plenty of dictatorship in the Arab world. But in countries like Egypt and the Emirat and even Saudi, that dictatorship is leveraged to privilege Islamophobic voices and to silence any rational, analytical Islamic voice. And the Hurra channel, again, paid for by tax dollars, US tax dollars, is a very critical component to this equation. Al-Hurra never entertains guests like Fahmi Huwaidi or like Muhammad Imara. Even Muslim voices that have a long track record in supporting human rights and democracy will never be guests on Alhurra. While the likes of Nawal al Saadawi are regular guests on Alhurra. We are trying to engineer an Islam that we deem acceptable. And remarkably, this Islam has no sacred text and has no sacred history, and in fact has no tradition in itself, because part and parcel of the message of these so-called Tanwiriyun, the enlightened, is that this Islamic tradition should be completely deconstructed and thrown away. So that Islam has no sacred space and no sacred territory, no sacred epistemology. So what remains of that Islam? Nothing. Nothing remains of that Islam. It is no longer an Islam. The remarkable authoritarian tools of the state are regularly leveraged to promote what are clearly Islamophobic outlooks in the Muslim world. It is no longer the case that if you are an atheist who mocks God or mocks the Quran or mocks the Prophet, that you will not find a platform in the Middle East. In fact, if you are an atheist who mocks God and mocks the Prophet and mocks Islam, you will be given a monopoly of platforms in a country like Egypt and a country like the Emirat. The only Islamic quote-unquote perspectives that are allowed to appear are the likes of Shahrur, who again differed with Nawal al Saadawi or Ibrahim Isa or Khalid Muntasir on practically nothing. You might be tempted to say, but wait, isn't the Muslim world going through the pangs of an enlightenment birth? Isn't that what enlightenment is about? Freedom of thought? That you have no secret space. It is only human reason that is sacred. Isn't the Hurra embracing and giving a platform to freedom thinkers who can spark an enlightenment in the Muslim world that would help bring the Muslim world to the 21st century? I have two responses to you. If this is what you think Alhurra is doing, then you know nothing about the history of colonialism and the history of imperialism. No country helps another to bring it within the range of competition with itself. The United States has no interest in helping Muslim countries develop to the point that they can compete on free and fair terms with the West. That's one. But second, and a far more important point, I am astounded at the ignorance and the stupidity of so many young pretenders who pretend to have knowledge. The Enlightenment in Europe as a movement in its very first articulations arose wedded to a spirit of love of scientific investigation. Figures like Bacon, Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, Leibniz, and Newton were fundamentally not about sexual freedom and not about denying heaven and hell. They were about the love of scientific research and the love of scientific discovery. But even more importantly, the Enlightenment in Europe was fundamentally a skepticism not directed at the idea of the sacred, but a skepticism directed at those who monopolize power in the name of a divine right or in the name of the public good. So the Enlightenment in Europe, when you talk about the thought of people like Bentham or Voltaire or Montesquieu or Rousseau or Thomas Paine or Diderot, the Enlightenment was deep skepticism about those who say we are in power and you should trust us to do what is good for you. Its skeptical outlook about matters of faith, or initially its deism, was a secondary matter to its principal objective. The principal objective is to demystify power and to reject the idea that those in power know better than that the ruler knows better than the ruled. The Enlightenment in Europe was not a revolution initially for sexual freedom. It was a revolution about scientific freedom and political freedom. And this is the critical point. The so-called enlightened Harakat Tanwiriyya in the Muslim world never talks about political freedom, never talks about democracy, never critiques the dictators in power. Nawal al Saadawi, who criticized Allah and the Prophet and everything Islamic, never had one critical thing to say about Sisi and his government. Never had one thing to say about the 100,000 political prisoners rotting in Egyptian prisons. Never had a single thing to say about the assassination of Khashoggi. Never had a single thing to say about the authoritarianism of Mohammed bin Salman or of Al Zayed in Yemen, in Emirat. The likes of Khalid Muntasir and Ibrahim Isa and Fatma Na'ud and Shahrur and all of them. Yes, they trash Islam night and day. But they don't tell you you have a right to choose your own leader. And you have a right to vote leaders out of office. They don't tell you that it is wrong for the rulers to arrest someone because of their opinions and torture them. They never talk about torture in state prisons. While they talk about banning the hijab, they never talk about the sexual assaults committed in political prisons in Egypt, in Syria, in Yemen, in the Emirates, in Saudi, in Yemen, in Libya. Not a single word. So yes, Alhurra has tanweeriyun. But those tanweeriyun, again, paid for by US dollars, never talk about Sisi's dictatorship. Even when 35 European countries condemned the abysmal human rights record in Egypt, not a single word in Alhurra channel about the human rights violations committed by the Sisi government. Not a single word. The day the UN report came out about Egypt, what was Alhurra channel talking about? The evils of the Quran, the evils of the Sunnah, the evils of the companions, through Ibrahim Isa and Khalid Muntasir and Islam al-Bahiri and the likes. They have nothing to say about torture and rape and murder that take place all over the Muslim world. This is the big difference. What's her name? Was heralded all over the West as a free thinker. Why? Because she trashes Islam. All of these institutions that gave her very prestigious awards, even Time magazine put her on a cover one of those years and declared her as the liberator of women because she rejects the institution of marriage, because she says that there's nothing wrong with adultery and fornication, because she mocks everything that the Quran has to say to women or about women. But none of these institutions and organizations asked her, Ya Nawal al Saadawi, there are 100,000 people in your country being tortured every single day. Do you have anything to say about that? Nothing. Women are raped in Egyptian political prisoners every day. Do you have anything to say about that? Nothing. While she openly criticized Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, she publicly refused to say anything critical about Sisi. What do you say about then the hypocrisy of Western institutions? That elevates such a woman to the status of heroes. And what do you say about the constitutional violation of our government taking on a radical radical program and a radical agenda such as that proposed by the likes of Hershey Ali for deconstructing Islam in the modern world, and doing so using American tax dollars. If American Muslims want a cause, I would strongly nominate this cause for you. Places like the Alhurra channel either should be true platforms for freedom of thought or should be shut down. Promptly shut down. How could it be that we American taxpayers fund a television channel that broadcasts 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, that does nothing but trash Islam? أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم وصلى الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم، والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وتبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. The Prophet ﷺ said in part of a hadith, أنتم الشهداء بعضكم على بعض. You are witnesses one upon another. You are witnesses one upon another. It is not the case anymore that what happens in the Muslim world stays in the Muslim world, and that what happens in the United States stays in the United States. It is not the case that Islamophobia can explode in the West and have no impact in the Muslim world, leave alone in places like India and China and Burma. In the same way, that is not the case that ISIS can try to establish a state in Iraq and Syria and that would have no effect on the rest of the world. The shahada that we now carry is a global shahada. When we testify, it is easy to testify to win the approval of the traditional handlers of elite power. The same elite that were behind the institutions of colonialism, the same elite that gloated upon the fall of communism, the same elite that looks at Islam as a natural and instinctive enemy because of its doctrines of egalitarianism and justice and truth. That same elite celebrates superficiality in thinking and glamorous but entirely vacuous points. Glamorous points like sexual freedom, personal freedom, the majesty of majesty of reason. That same elite has done something that is very pernicious. Very pernicious. They have fooled so many Muslims into thinking that just trashing the Quran and trashing the Sunnah means that you're a freedom thinker or that you're a free thinker. What they skipped over is that the impetus and soul of freedom of thought that gave rise to the Enlightenment was a mad rush to invest in scientific inquiry and to promote scientific inquiry. That doesn't exist in the Muslim world. There is a mad rush in the Muslim world to invest in luxury items and consume luxury items. There's no connection between critical thought and scientific investment. But even more importantly, the Enlightenment was a deeply skeptical movement about the privileges of power. The Enlightenment was about the type of monopoly of power that kings and queens and noblemen enjoyed. The Enlightenment went hand in hand with the French Revolution and the English Revolution. None of those people that are sponsored by Alhurra channel are about that. They never talk about democracy. They never talk about human rights. They never talk about limiting the abuses of those in power. They only talk about the evil of Islam and Islamists and how Islam is a problem. This is why I cannot celebrate someone like Nawal al Saadawi as a freedom thinker. I cannot celebrate her as a good novelist because I've read too much literature and she's not. She just wasn't a good novelist. But I cannot celebrate her so-called freedom of thought because that freedom of thought was directed only at what would get her applause in the West and what would win her admiration in the West. But it had nothing to say to the thousands of people that sit rotting in political prisons as we speak. Her critical insights turned a complete blind eye to the numerous human rights abuses committed against street children all over a country where she lived and died, like Egypt. Every day in Egypt, street children are raped and sexually abused and trafficked and even killed, and their organs are harvested and traded on the open black market. And Nawal al Saadawi had nothing to say about that. Freedom thinker? Defender of human rights? The Prophet ﷺ, the hadith said, يوشك أن تعرفوا أهل الجنة من أهل النار قالوا بما يا رسول الله قال بالثناء الحسن والثناء السيء. It is possible that you would know the people of heaven from the people of hellfire. And they said, how? He said, who has a good reputation and who has an ill reputation. I often wondered if the Prophet ﷺ lived in our age, day and age, would he say the same? When reputations are engineered by magicians like the magicians of the Pharaoh, crafted and leveraged and directed, when a woman like Nawal al Saadawi, who in her last will and testament said, I don't want my body washed and I don't want anyone to pray on me, because she didn't believe in Allah, but yet she didn't believe in Allah or the Quran or Islam or any of it. But yet, Al-Arabiya channel, Alhurra channel, the Egyptian channels, the Emirati channels, even the Saudi channels are insisting that Nawal al Saadawi was a great Islamic thinker. And then they wonder why some Muslims go insane and become mad and do crazy things. اللهم اصلح لنا الحال. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا واعف عنا وارحمنا يا تواب يا رحيم واهدنا سواء السبيل والصراط المستقيم. Allah, forgive our sins, grant us the right guidance, direct us towards the straight path, open our hearts and our minds to the light of your grace, Ya Ali, Ya Azim, Ya Rabbal Alameen, wa salli wa sallim wa barik ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa tawabu ihsan ila yawm al-din wa aqim salat.